Alright, welcome back friends. So in today's video we're gonna do things a bit different. Today I want to talk about one of the most important principles that every artist or creative person should know about. And along with that, you can watch me paint my little companion Mew into my sketchbook. So without further ado, let's start talking about one of the greatest art advices out there. Okay, so 80% of what we do is pretty much pointless. What? How so, you ask? Well, one thing after another. So, in 1906, the Italian economist Wilfredo Pareto created a mathematical formula to describe the unequal distribution of wealth in his country. And what he found was that 20% of the people owned and produced 80% of the wealth in his country. And later, he also noticed this unequal distribution in his own garden, when he realized that 20% of the pea pods contained 80% of the peas. Over the following decades, many other people have observed similar phenomena in different areas, and this has later become recognized as a universal principle called the vital few and the trivial many. Today this is known as the Pareto principle, or the 80-20 rule, and it is one of the most important and helpful principles to know about to be more effective and productive, and also to be a bit happier. So what exactly is the 80-20 rule? It's actually quite simple. The Pareto principle states that approximately 80% of all effects come from roughly 20% of the causes. Or in other words, most of what we do, roughly 80%, has little to no effect. The main idea is to realize that a small number of causes produce a large percentage of the effect. And this is something that applies to our professional as well as our personal lives. Here are some examples of how the 80-20 rule applies in real life that might sound very familiar to some of you. 80% of the time is spent on 20% of the apps on your phone. 20% of the shows you watch account for 80% of your enjoyment. 20% of your clients create 80% of your income. Or, on the other hand, 80% of the complaints come from 20% of your clients. The Pareto principle can be found in all areas of our lives. I mean, this is probably even true for wearing your shoes. You probably wear 20% of the shoes you own 80% of the time. Once you start looking, you will see it everywhere. And what's so great about it is that it often means that by focusing on just 20% of what's wrong, we can expect to solve 80% of the problems. Now, don't get too caught up on the exact numbers here. The numbers don't always have to be 80-20, and they also don't always have to add up to 100%. 100% of your income can also come from 10% of your collectors. It's not a mathematical law, it's a rule of thumb. The point isn't the exact numbers, but how more often than not things aren't distributed equally, and they usually aren't. One way of applying the 80-20 rule to your life could simply be to ask yourself this question. What is the 20% of my day that is producing 80% of my happiness? And most of us will probably realize that, indeed, the majority of the things that we enjoy doing, or that make us happy, happen in a time span of a few hours. Maybe the last few hours of the day. Figuring out when those hours are and how we spend them ultimately allows us to consciously focus on them and therefore maximize happiness. If you realize that you are most happy in the few hours after work when you go out for dinner with friends, you should do that more often. If you have the most fun watching a TV show in the evening, well, then you should spend some time and energy on making that experience the best it can be. You will find the Pareto principle in all areas of your life. But since we're talking about it in the context of being an artist and creating art, let's talk about some practical ways we can apply this principle to our daily lives. So let's start with the example of creating a piece of art. And since I'm a painter, I will go with the example of creating a painting. So when I start a painting, it actually doesn't take much time to get a good impression of how the finished painting will look like. And at some point in the process, the painting stops going through major changes. Once I've filled out the whole painting surface and everything is in its place, the changes start to become so minute that they sometimes only become apparent when viewed up close, or when viewed in direct comparison to the earlier stages in the process, which basically never happens. Of course, you can put all your efforts into one painting and try to get 100% of the results, but you can also spend just 20% of your time and effort and get 80% of the results. Many will say that it's totally worth it if you put everything you have into one piece you're working on. And sure, the end result can be great if everything works out, which is never guaranteed. But the question is it worth more than having 5 pieces of art, of which some are almost as good and maybe a couple even just as good? Or is it worth more than having created 2 pieces of art and having a whole bunch of free time that you can spend on doing other things that make you happy? I think in everyday life, for the most part at least, the answer is clear. Instead of spending 1 week on creating a piece of art, spend 1 day on sketching and collecting ideas, and then 4 days on realizing a couple of the most promising ones. And on the other 2 days, you spend your time with your family and friends or do whatever else makes you happy. Working this way doesn't only produce a much higher volume of high quality work, but you're also focusing your energy on what's most promising and effective. The point is to realize that you have the option to focus on the important 20% and not waste all your time and energy on the things that have very little significance. If you're a beginner and you're just starting out, you can focus your energies on the things that will bring you the most bang for your buck. Do you really need to be able to draw and paint everything in every medium and style? Well, no, not when you're starting out. Figure out what's most important. In case of drawing and painting, it's the ability to capture likeness and lighting situations. So basically, getting better at drawing and painting in black and white is the best thing you can do. And once you understand that, you can start to focus 80% of your time on developing these skills instead of spending it on a bunch of things that ultimately aren't as important. Or do you ever find yourself working all day, but at the end of the day, you look back and you realize you haven't achieved much that's productive? Well, this happens because 20% of the least important things often end up taking 80% of our time. A good way to solve this issue is to, at the start of the day, make a list of maybe 10 things you have to do or work on. Then you go through your list and find out what the 3 or 2 most valuable or important things are. And once you've figured that out, you can spend 80% of your time working on those things. This way, even if you don't get everything done, you make sure that whatever you get done is most productive. So as you can see, the Pareto principle doesn't imply that you shouldn't spend a lot of time on one project or task. It rather means that you don't get caught up in the 80% that won't really make much of a difference. In fact, the Pareto principle doesn't even suggest you work less. It just indicates that you need to focus your efforts and only work hard in areas that matter most. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there's also a time and place for perfectionism, or spending all your time and effort on one specific task. Perfecting a concept or a technique can be a very important thing. But on the other hand, sometimes there's also work that just needs to get done. Work that isn't part of the important 20%, but that will enable you to focus on the important things once it's out of the way. This could be paperwork, cleaning up, organizing, or prep work. In these cases, it's best to just sit down and get the work done. The Pareto principle is actually pretty straightforward. If you can identify the 20% that create the most rewards, you can also spend more time on doing the things that create the greater rewards. And on the flip side, you can also cut back on the 80% of the time that is often less important, since it only creates 20% of the rewards. So, the takeaway is basically this. The Pareto principle is a practical guideline that can lead to greater effectiveness and also help us use our time and resources in a way that leads to better results. And that's all it is. It's just another tool that helps us realize our visions. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all so much for watching. Please hit like, subscribe if you're not already a subscriber, and yeah, have a good one.